Well, welcome. My name is Michael Peppard, and I'm a professor of theology here at Fordham and on the staff of the Curran Center, who's hosting this event. And as always, we're so grateful at the Curran Center for our sponsors and donors and supporters who make what we do possible, whether it's our undergraduate concentration, to our many campus events, to our publications and book series with Fordham University Press. We're very grateful, and we're happy that you're joining us tonight. As we gather to learn more about the life of Thomas Merton, I have a personal reason to wish him a happy birthday today. And that is because Thomas Merton is responsible for getting me my first job. So let me explain. I was fresh out of college, and I had promised my parents that if they allowed me to major in philosophy and theology, which they weren't happy about, but if they allowed it, that I would never ask them for money after I graduated. That was I promised, okay? But then I graduated, and it was already June, and I only had two kind of opportunities left. So one of these opportunities had a decent salary, it had some cultural status, and it was in Washington, D.C. And the other was teaching high school in the place where I grew up, a life of service. So now I should clarify, this was a Jesuit high school, and so it was a good school, right? It was a Jesuit high school, and it was in Denver, Colorado, which Greg is like the Calgary of the United States, okay? It was in Denver. Greg's Canadian. Now both of these job offers were looking legitimate, and so I had a decision to make. And what did I have on the airplane with me on the way to that final interview? I had Merton's No Man is an Island, a collection of essays. And I don't recall the exact lines, but there were impassioned exhortations about charity and a life of service in No Man is an Island. And that convinced me that if I was made this offer of teaching high school, I should opt for that job. Now, not only that, there's more. My final interview was with the department chair of this Jesuit high school, and he asked me over dinner who my favorite theologian was. And I wanted to say Merton, but I was a little bit nervous, because Merton is not everyone's cup of tea. There's not even one Merton. There's a lot of Mertons. But I went ahead and said I thought I should be honest, so I said Thomas Merton. And the department chair smiled very broadly. And it turns out the department chair is a man named Chris Pramick, who went on to become a scholar of Merton and is currently the president of the International Thomas Merton Society. So it was a right answer. It was the best answer I could have given. So Thomas Merton got me a job with the Jesuits. And for this, I'm very grateful, and I want to say happy birthday to him. In recent years, I've been learning more about Merton from the person that we'll learn with tonight. Gregory Hillis is professor of theology and religious studies at Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky. A native of Western Canada, he moved to Kentucky and joined the faculty of Bellarmine in 2008, after completing his PhD in the Department of Religious Studies at McMaster University in Ontario. I first came to know Greg through his research on early Christian theology, with a particular focus on St. Cyril of Alexandria. He has published a number of academic articles on Cyril's theology and recently wrote the introduction to a new translation of Cyril's biblical commentary, published in 2018 by Catholic University of America Press. Over the last few years, he has turned his attention to the life and writings of Merton, whose literary estate is housed at the Merton'S Center at Bellarmine University. In addition to teaching a popular undergraduate course on Merton, Dr. Hillis has written both academic articles and popular articles on his life and thought. He has also delivered lectures around the United States on Merton's theology. Now, I should also say that Greg has become a rare voice of moderation and wisdom in the chaotic world of Catholic Twitter. He even earned something rare for a theology professor, the coveted blue checkmark, which must be in honor of his eloquent tweets about Catholicism and his beloved Toronto Blue Jays. His recent book on Thomas Merton, Man of Dialogue, Thomas Merton's Catholic Vision, is published with Liturgical Press, and everyone should buy a copy. It's a great choice for when we all limit our screen time during Lent, right upcoming next. So tonight we're eager to hear his reflections and expansions from this book, a talk titled Thomas Merton and M, What Merton's Affair with a Nurse Taught Him About Love and Humility. Please join me in welcoming Gregory Hillis.
Thomas Merton helped me get a job. And I was with Dr. O'Donnell's class this morning, or this afternoon, talking about Thomas Merton. And the students were asking me about how I got into Thomas Merton. And I had read him when I was 23. I read The Seven-Storey Mountain, and it was, for me, at a time when I was having a vocational crisis, which often happens in your early 20s. If you haven't had one yet, you will. And this book is all about somebody having a vocational crisis. And I started reading everything after that that Merton wrote and his journals. And then what I didn't tell the students was that in a really what I call a sort of fit of youthful exuberance, I got a tattoo of a drawing that Merton did of a monk, and it's on my left arm. And I believe I mentioned this to the search committee at Bellarmine, and I think they thought we should probably get the guy that has Merton literally tattooed on his arm at the place where the center is, so probably him. Although I will say that the treasurer, the former treasurer at the monastery, has said that I should be paying royalties from my salary to the abbey for having gotten this job through the tattoo. But anyways, we'll see. Let me just get right into it. In the April 2019 issue of Harper's Magazine, Gary Wills, a prolific, I need this to. In the April 2019 issue of Harper's Magazine, Gary Wills, a prolific Catholic writer of many different books, reviewed a book on Thomas Merton by the famed author Mary Gordon. His review, however, ended up being not so much a review of the book as it was an opportunity for Wills to air his grievances with Merton, whom he characterized as a shallow monk and thinker. According to Wills, Merton was little more than a disgruntled pseudo-ascetic who enjoyed cultivating an adoring fan club that included celebrities, Catholic and non-Catholic alike. He was, according to Wills, not so much a monk as he was a writer in a monastery that gave him special treatment only because his books provided the abbey with money. Such special treatment included a hermitage, which Wills described as a state of virtual secession within the monastery, where Merton was able to get away from an abbot and a monastery he detested. However, it's not Merton's attitude toward the monastery that Wills focused his attention on, but his illicit relationship with a nurse, a relationship that occurred during the summer of 1966. For Wills, this relationship was the ultimate example of Merton's shallowness as a monk, who felt he deserved special treatment. He recounted that Merton used trips to Louisville to meet influential friends, but he used this as an excuse to see this nurse, and that after he was ordered to end the relationship by his abbot, he continued to meet with her clandestinely because he didn't feel that the rules applied to him. This struck Wills as horribly smug, and was further evidence of the web of lies that is at one with the pattern built into his apostolate as the with-it monk, as Wills calls him. Mary Gordon also touched on Merton's affair with M in her book. By the way, I'm referring to her as M because that's how she's referred to in the journals themselves. I know her name, we all know her name, but I think it's just for the sake of recognizing that we don't have her account. I think it's important to not just talk about her with her not being present. Gordon's treatment of this relationship was sympathetic, but so brief as to gloss over the relationship as being of no consequence. Perhaps Wills's angry recounting of Merton's affair was due in part to Gordon's somewhat sentimental account, but whatever the case may be, Will's review put Merton's relationship with M back into the spotlight. Judging from the reaction, many apparently learned about the relationship for the very first time with Wills's review, this despite the fact that this relationship was public knowledge ever since the 1984 publication of the biography, the official biography of Merton by Michael Mott. It's a book called The Seven Mountains of Thomas Merton. Merton's private journals had not yet been published when this biography was published, but he stipulated that the journals could not be published until 25 years after his death. But Mott did have full access, and he described Merton's relationship with M in detail. But 35 years had passed between Mott's biography and Wills's Harper essay. So this essay meant that Merton's relationship was a revelation to a whole new group of people. The reaction by some Catholics already unsympathetic to Merton was predictable. A piece in the Catholic Herald by Chad Pecknold, a professor of theology at the Catholic University of America, is representative. Despite admitting that he hadn't actually read Merton, Pecknold argued that such an affair is precisely what one would expect from someone like Merton, a, quote, Catholic icon of 60s optimism, an icon which was morally and spiritually deleted enough to seek solace in the round, full hips of his lover, end quote. And to hammer home his point that Merton should in no way be venerated, Chad ended the piece by asking his readers to pray for all souls in purgatory like Merton. The reaction of other Catholics whose consciences have been formed by the Me Too movement and who had lived through a seemingly endless number of revelations regarding clerical sexual abuse was also unsympathetic, though for different reasons. When Merton and M met, he was a 51-year-old priest, and M was in her early 20s. Some justifiably raised questions not only about the propriety of the relationship, but also about whether their relationship was fully consensual. Moreover, even if, as the evidence suggests to me, the relationship was indeed consensual, the reality is that Merton acted irresponsibly and without a full appreciation of the power differential that existed between him and M. None of this can or should be ignored. I'm really not interested in defending Merton's relationship with her, nor do I think it merits a sympathetic treatment. But I do think it merits a more serious exploration than that provided beforehand. There's a flippancy to the way that Gary Wills and Gordon and Pecknold all treat Merton's relationship. Gordon's treatment was sympathetic, and as a result, glossed over the entire relationship as being of little consequence, while both Wills and Pecknold used the relationship as a bludgeon for condemnation. None of them examined Merton's agonized details or thoughts about his love for M, her love for him, and the threat that this relationship posed to his vocation. And none of them looked at what Merton had to say about the relationship in the years that followed. I spent a great deal of time and effort in recent years arguing against those who are suspicious of Merton. They feel that he doesn't need to be taken seriously as a Catholic thinker because of his interactions with those in Eastern religions and for other reasons. I've argued that he does need to be taken seriously, that he was someone who was deeply shaped by the Catholic tradition. And if you want to know more about that argument, my book is $24.95. But to take Merton seriously, we also need to take into account the events that took place in the summer of 1966. It's important to acknowledge at the outset, though, that we only have one side of the story. M has remained silent about this relationship to this day. Friends and acquaintances of the two have filled in some of the picture, but the reality is that the lion's share of the details we have come from Merton's pen. So it will be his account of the affair that will be my focus. And what we'll see from his account is that we get a clear sense of his own shortcomings. His account shows him at his most selfish and self-absorbed, but it also shows him grappling with his own with his own evident shortcomings, with what I think is honesty and humility. Sorry, I'll go back to that. So how did it all begin? Well, on March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation, Merton had an operation on his back at St. Joseph's Hospital in Louisville. A little less than a year earlier, Merton was given permission to live permanently as a hermit with the blessing of his abbot and his community, not because they felt he merited some sort of special treatment, but because the Cistercian order had come to acknowledge its own tradition of solitaries and understood Merton to have a calling to the hermit life. A number of other monks at Gethsemani also became hermits soon thereafter, including Merton's own abbot in 1968 when he retired. Merton loved the hermit life, but it took a physical toll, and his back soon gave him trouble. Necessary tasks like chopping wood became impossible for him, and an operation proved inevitable. Merton was nervous about the procedure, yet in a journal entry written 2 days before the operation, he talked about his faith in Christ. This is what he wrote, quote, "I know I have to die sometime, and may this not all be the beginning of it? I don't know. But if it is, I accept it in full freedom and gladness. My life stands offered with that of Christ, my brother." End quote. He concluded the entry by reflecting on his monastic brethren. Quote, "Certainly the spirit of the community here is excellent, and the place is blessed." End quote. The operation was successful, though recovery was slow. His first journal entry after the operation was written at the Hermitage a little over 2 weeks after his operation. He recounted in the entry his slow and ongoing recovery, and his description contains the first reference to M. It's clear the two hit it off from the start. Now, I'm going to start quoting Merton's journals here, and I have to admit, they're pretty cringy when he's writing about M, almost embarrassingly so. This is what he wrote. "I got a very friendly and devoted student nurse working on my compresses, etc., and this livened things up considerably. In fact, we were getting perhaps too friendly by the time she went off on her Easter vacation, but her affection, undisguised and frank, was an enormous," and he underlined this point, "an enormous help in bringing me back to life fast." The care he received from M and the other nurses was life-giving, and indeed Merton writes that their friendship led him to realize that he had a need for, quote, "feminine companionship and love," end quote, that he didn't know that he had. Another week and a half went by. Perhaps Merton was thinking about M, but his journal contains no references to her during these days. But on April 19th, a letter appeared from her. We don't know what exactly was in the letter, but Merton was clearly flattered and had to admit that the affection, even love, that she expressed for him in the letter was mutual. Upon receiving the letter, he knew he had to grapple deeply with the love that he had for her, knowing that he was called to a life dedicated to God. "The question of love," he writes, "I have to face the fact that I have simply sidestepped it. Now it must be faced squarely. I cannot live without giving love back to a world that has given me so much. And of course, it has to be the love of a man dedicated to God, and selfless, detached, free, completely open love." Merton seemed to think that the love that he felt for M could be incorporated in some way into his life as a hermit, that somehow this love could be channeled into a general love for the whole world. It's pretty hard to know what Merton meant, though I venture to guess that at this point he didn't envision the two of them having a relationship. What is clear is that he had very little clue about what to do with M's feelings for him, and he had no idea what to do with his feelings for her. 2 days later, things became more serious when M wrote to tell him that she would like to see him. Merton admitted to himself that he wanted to see her too. "I tell myself it is because I want to help her," he wrote, telling himself that he couldn't become emotionally attached. 2 days after her letter, they had a long, illicit phone conversation. Merton used one of the monastery phones to chat with her. They spoke again about wanting to see one another, and Merton realized that with this phone call and his unwillingness to stop communicating with her, he had crossed a line he knew he should not have crossed. Both knew that a relationship between them could have no future, and Merton wrote that he should end it before things become more complicated. He didn't. His journal entry for April 27, 1966, begins with a harsh realization. Quote, "There is no question that I am in deep," end quote. M met him in the doctor's office when he was in Louisville for an appointment. We were talking with the students about the fact that Merton was always at the doctor. He had issues. She met him in the doctor's office when he was in Louisville for an appointment, and afterwards the two sat alone for a half hour in Cunningham's, which was a popular downtown eatery. It was during this lunch that, according to Merton, they both realized they were in love. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. More than ever, I saw how much and how instantly and how delicately we respond to each other on every level. Also, I can see why she is scared. I am too. There is a sense of awful, awesome, rather sexual affinity, and of course there can be no hesitation about my position here. I have vows, and I must be faithful to them. And I told myself that I can and will be, but I have moments of being scared too. Apart from that, though, we had a very good talk, and once again it was clearer than ever that we are terribly in love, and it is the kind of love that can virtually tear you apart. After this reflection, he immediately brought up his vows again, acknowledging that the relationship with M clearly had the potential to threaten his faithfulness to them. Sort of Captain Obvious at that point. But at this point, he naively thought he could maintain a relationship with her without violating his vows. He went on in the entry to write that he wanted simply to be friends. But he knew that things had gone too far, and he had no idea how to respond. She, quote, "is so tragically full of passion and so wide open. My response has been too total and too forthright. We have admitted too much, communicated all the fire to each other, and now we are caught," end quote. He sums up the situation with a succinct realization of himself. Quote, "I am not as smart or as stable as I imagined," end quote. Their relationship lasted 2 months. Merton entered the relationship naively, thinking that they could simply be friends. But they both appeared to realize very quickly that they were in love. This was the first time he had ever truly loved or been loved by a woman. Without playing too much of the amateur psychologist, I would suggest that any of the assessment of the affair needs to take into account the fact that Merton's relationships with women prior to entering the monastery appeared to be uniformly poor, at least from his assessment. He remembered his mother as harsh, as demanding, as a distant presence. His relationships with women as a teenager and as a college student appeared not to be on a deep level. Somewhat famously, Merton had a reputation as a womanizer during his one and only year at Cambridge. Merton's description of his life while studying at Columbia contained few references to women. All of his close friends were men. Merton entered the Abbey apparently never having experienced genuine love for or from a woman, and when this love appeared unexpectedly in 1966, he had no clue how to respond. His journal entries early in the relationship are embarrassingly euphoric. "I respond so much to her now," he wrote after speaking to her on the phone, "to the inflections of her voice, her laughter, everything, that I was flooded with peace and happiness and wanted just to talk to her forever." He continued, "All I know is that I love her so much, I can hardly think of anything but her." In another entry, he acknowledged that by all standards, his relationship with M, quote, "is all wrong, absurd, insane," end quote. And yet, he writes, "I can't help coming back again and again to the realization that somehow it is not crazy. It makes sense." A week later, he wrote, quote, "Clearly this love is not a contradiction of my solitude, but a mysterious part of it. It fits strangely and without conflict into my inner life of meditation and prayer. There's really amazing logistical gymnastics going on there. But anyways, Merton seemed to think that his relationship somehow squared with his vocation as a hermit because he believed the relationship benefited M. She loved him, and returning that love brought her joy and support and help, according to Merton. He sometimes talked about the relationship as if it was solely an opportunity to bring her happiness. Yes, I realize I'm behind here. 1 second. Yes, he writes, sorry, I missed a couple of those quotes, but this is, it's the bottom quote. He says, "Of course, I would be more peaceful, secure, and safe just minding my own business in the hermitage and trying to forget her. But thank God for this blessed disturbance, for this love that sometimes upsets me, which, at a certain cost to me, makes another person happier." Needless to say, Merton's attempts to justify to himself how he was staying true to his calling as a hermit while maintaining a relationship with a woman stretched logic to the breaking point. Perhaps his attempts to justify this relationship were due to his belief that he was being transformed both by her love for him and by the love that he didn't know he was capable of expressing. He wrote, "I realize that the deepest capacities for human love in me have never even been tapped, that I too can love with an awful completeness. Responding to her has opened up the depths of my life in ways I can't begin to understand or analyze now." The relationship was proving to be revelatory in ways he did not feel he could ignore or set aside. Even as the relationship began to take on more physical expressions, and it did, Merton wrote about the way in which their love was helping him to come to terms with his own sexuality. While his sexual encounters before his conversion to Catholicism were marked by an unhappiness that was the result of his own desire for sexual conquest, such was not the case with M. After describing an afternoon of physical intimacy, he managed to convince somebody to drive her out to the woods at the Abbey, and the two went off to the woods. After describing this afternoon in the woods of physical intimacy, and I should make clear that Merton said that their intimacy, at least that afternoon, did not involve the consummation of their physical relationship. Merton wrote that his sexuality has been made real and decent again, end quote. I really can't, I need to read you how he describes this, because this is Merton at his most cringy. He writes, "We ate herring and ham." He's describing them in the woods. "We ate herring and ham," in brackets, "not very much eating," exclamation point, "and drank our wine and read poems and talked of ourselves and mostly made love and love and love for 5 hours. And though we had over and over reassured ourselves and agreed that our love would have to continue always chaste, and this sacrifice was essential, yet in the end we were getting rather sexy. We now love with our whole bodies anyway, and I have the complete feel of her being, except her sex, as completely me." I wanted to read that because it's going to relate to a point I'm going to make later about the fact that he kept these things in his journal. Nevertheless, the tension between his monastic solitude and his love for M became glaringly, though belatedly, obvious to him. In an entry on May 24th, he admitted the limitations of their relationship. Each of them was holding back something of themselves from each other, perhaps recognizing that the relationship compromised something essential about each of their identities. In Merton's case, he knew that his deepest calling was to the solitude of the hermitage. He writes, "The thing is that we do not meet completely in our love. It is partial, not whole. There are aspects of ourselves, sides of ourselves that come together, are in harmony, respond deeply, but there are other sides which do not. And where we do meet, we try to pull ourselves wholly together and fail. Each tries to envelop the whole self of the other. And this is where my own ambiguities come into play. My deepest self evades this and is jealous of absolute freedom and solitude. Hers, too, has its reservations. The freedom to love others, and perhaps this is why we both protest so much about our own love, about our love, the wholeness of it, the totality of it. Have any two people ever sworn to each other such total and unending love? I guess all lovers do, but do we really mean it? Are we in a position to mean it? I think we are desperately trying to persuade ourselves and failing. Why do we think it necessary to persuade ourselves in the first place? A few days later, Merton wrote about his confusion, anguish, indecision, and nerves in the wake of their afternoon of passion in the woods. He couldn't bring himself to end the relationship. He loved her, and he knew that she loved him. He mused that perhaps the most merciful thing for them both would be to have the superiors end the relationship. He acknowledged their sexual temptation to be overwhelming. And while they had both agreed to keep their relationship chaste, he had to admit that, quote, "we are not safe with each other," end quote. The next day, in an anguished entry that both celebrated and lamented the love he felt for M, Merton wrote, quote, "I should never have got in love in the first place," end quote. The conflict between his vocation and his relationship heated up as May gave way to June. A long passage from his June 2nd entry merits full quotation, if only because it so clearly demonstrates the depth of the internal conflict Merton experienced. Sorry, it's as small as I could, or as big as I could make it. This love cannot be a matter of playing around. I wrote in a way that it could. It's altogether serious. It scares me at times. She has given up saying we should live together and fully accepts my vows, etc., but love demands contact and much communication, and this remains a constant problem here. My phone calls are illegal, and so too are some of our meetings. This does not make for peace, but it meets the demands of love, and I think in conscience and in love I must meet them. The sincerity and depths of all this will probably be tested, and God knows I will need help. But there's something in me that wants freedom at any price and can claim all sorts of religious justification. More or less clear-sightedly, at least now, I'm going in the opposite direction. I'm taking a course that can be harmful to me as a monk, a contemplative, and a writer. And I'm doing it for love. Not out of passion and enthusiasm, but out of simple love for M. However, I think it is understood that when a showdown with the vows comes, I have to stick to the vows. The next day he wrote, "There is a real danger of my cracking up under the pressures and contradictions of love in my absurd situation." On the feast of Corpus Christi 6 days later, Merton wrote shamefully about celebrating the Mass with his fellow monk priests. I stood there among all the others, soberly aware of myself as a priest who has a woman. In the entry, Merton expressed a realization that sooner or later the relationship would have to come to an end, but he just couldn't end it himself. He was convinced that the love they had for each other was genuine and true. Just how complicated this situation was for Merton is made clear from his June 10th entry. He acknowledged that he loved her more than he had ever loved another woman, another human being. And as he wrote, "She tells me over and over that she loves me totally, with a love she has never known before for anyone, and a love that she could not possibly give to anyone else." But he did not want to give up who he was called to be, a hermit at the Abbey of Gethsemane. And he wrote honestly about the ways in which the relationship was pushing him in uncomfortable directions. Scruples about my vocation and worries about preserving my old identity are the two things that get in the way. For this love will eventually change me completely, and is changing me already, and unconsciously with great anguish sometimes I resent it. And that evening, as he meditated before the Blessed Sacrament, He faced fully the challenge the relationship posed to his identity and vocation. Her love is not just another question and another problem. It is right at the center of all my questions and problems, and right at the center of my hermit life. Merton traveled to Louisville the next day to get a bursitis shot in his elbow. While in town, he arranged with his psychologist and friend, Jim Weigel, to meet M alone in his office. In order to protect the privacy of those still living, as M is, the entry describing this meeting has been censored, and the Merton Legacy Trust, the trust established by Merton to oversee the publication of his work, continues to withhold access to it. The reason appears to be that Merton and M experienced a level of physical intimacy that they had not had before, and the trust sees no need to violate M's privacy by allowing Merton's description of their physical intimacy to be made public. Whatever took place in Weigel's office, Merton realized that the relationship could not continue. We can't go on like this. I can't leave her. I have to try and live the life I have chosen, yet I love her. Two days later, the end came. More accurately, the beginning of the end came. On June 13, Merton's abbot, Dom James Fox, with whom Merton had a tumultuous relationship, returned home from a trip. When Merton went to the cellulor's office to call M illicitly, he learned that another monk had listened in on one of his earlier calls and reported what he had heard to the abbot. Far from experiencing anger, Merton expressed relief. I have to face the fact that I have been wrong and foolish in all this. Much as I loved M, I should never have let myself be carried away to become so utterly imprudent. Well, it is clearly over now. Truth be told, though, the relationship didn't end completely with the abbot's discovery. Merton wrote that Dom James Fox was kind and understanding about the relationship, but he did order a complete and immediate break. Merton felt that in conscience he couldn't break so immediately and completely without doing irreparable harm to M. He felt the relationship needed to taper off. She was, by his telling, heartbroken that the relationship was ending, and he felt that he had an obligation to her to console her. There were a few more clandestine phone calls, as well as some illicit meetings in Louisville, but Merton realized that the relationship was effectively over. That messes up technology, and I'm totally one of those professors. He says, I am alone and I love her. But the choice between her and solitude presented itself, and I chose solitude. 4 days later, he reflected on their relationship as follows. I realized that no matter how much I may love M and be attached to her, there has never for a moment really been a choice. If it is a question of leaving Gethsemane and trying to live with her, and staying here in solitude, and doing whatever it is I'm supposed to do, then the answer is easy. There's not even a credible question. On July 16, he met with her in Louisville at Cherokee Park for one last meeting. The two spoke of the love they shared for one another, and she proposed that he leave the monastery so that they could spend the rest of their lives together. Merton, however, knew the impossibility of this and felt that perhaps her impressions of him were based less on reality than on the ideals she had of him. This was to be their final meeting, and while it was difficult for Merton no longer to see her, he realized that this was a choice he had to make. In his review of Mary Gordon's book, Gary Wills argued that Merton felt no compunction about this relationship, that it was simply part of a life of deception. But a careful reading of Merton's private journals reveals a more complex situation. Merton was not a man in search of love, but by his own telling was someone who experienced the love of and for a woman for the first time. Caught in the throes of this love, he acted recklessly, and his journal entries from this time read more like the reflections of a heart-struck teenager than a 51-year-old respected monk and writer. But in the months and years after their relationship ended, Merton's assessment of the relationship were far more sober. Wills doesn't refer to any of these assessments. Rather, to prove that Merton was simply playing around with his vows, he pointed to the fact that Merton called M from a payphone in the days following the vow Merton made before Dom James Fox on September 8th, a vow in which he promised to live in solitude for the rest of my life insofar as health may permit. Clearly, according to Wills, Merton wasn't taking seriously his need to enter the monastic life more fully. However, these events, what Wills points to, demonstrate that Merton still didn't know quite what to do with the love that he had for M in the months following their relationship. But as time went on, Merton came to understand. Admittedly, and lamentably late, Merton never grappled with and it never did. Merton never grappled with the power differential that existed between them. While there appears to be no reason to doubt, as I said, the relationship was fully consensual, the reality is that Merton's age and stature, in contrast to M, cannot but raise our eyebrows in 2023. This didn't raise eyebrows in 1966, and Merton didn't address the clear disadvantage M had in the relationship. He was in love with her, she was in love with him, and that was that, according to Merton. But he did write about how conflicted he had become when thinking about the relationship in the months after it ended. In an entry from his private journal written 10 months after his relationship was discovered by the abbot, Merton wrote about what might have occurred had the relationship gone too far. While wandering through the woods, Merton reflected on the moment of intimacy that they had in the psychologist's office and how this affected him at the time. We can see that Merton was far more conflicted internally than he perhaps let on in his journal entries from that summer. That Sunday, he wrote, I was literally shaken and disturbed, knowing clearly that I was all wrong, that I was going against everything that made sense in my life, going against all that was true and authentic in my vocation, going against the grace and love of God, struggling desperately in my heart and knowing I was helpless, that things were moving in a certain direction and I had gone too far to turn back. And as he looked back on the end of their relationship, Merton expressed relief. After that, only the grace of God saved us from a really terrible mess. It was fortunate that we were simply not able to see each other when we wanted to. And finally, it was a good thing that we stopped altogether, though it ought to have been done differently. A few weeks later, Merton expressed further regret about the relationship and wrote about his need for divine forgiveness. I experience in myself a deep need of conversion and penance, a deep repentance, a real sense of having erred, gone wrong, got lost, and needing to get back on the right track, needing to pray for forgiveness, sense of revolt at my own foolishness and triviality, shame and amazement at the way I have trifled with life and grace. How could I be so utterly stupid? More than a year later, just before he left for his ill-fated trip to Asia, Merton's thoughts on the relationship were even more stark. Today, among other things, I burned M's letters. Incredible stupidity of 1966. I did not even glance at any one of them. Just in concluding, Merton established the Merton Legacy Trust in 1967 to oversee his literary estate and take responsibility for the publication of his works after his death. The trust stipulated that his private journals could be published only after the publication of an authorized biography, and 25 years had elapsed after his death. Merton put no other restrictions on the publication of his journals. He was uninterested in having them purged of anything unsavory, not least because he was disturbed by what he saw took place after the publication of his autobiography, The Seven-Storey Mountain. While he never disowned the autobiography that propelled him to fame, he found the book to be overly pious. It lent itself to an image of himself that lacked reality. Unfortunately, the book was a bestseller, he said in an interview with the journalist Thomas MacDonald, and has become a kind of edifying legend or something. This is a dreadful fate. I am trying my best to live it down. I rebel against it and maintain my basic human right not to be turned into a Catholic myth for children in parochial schools. Merton did not want the same thing to happen with his journals. If he was going to be known, he was going to be known. It's the forthrightness of his journals that continues to attract readers like me. To read Merton's private journals is to be given unique access to the kind of inner thoughts, compulsions, emotions that all of us experience but often don't understand or communicate to others. Merton allowed himself to become an open book, warts and all. His self-assessments were brutally honest and frequently unflattering. And, admittedly, his unflattering gaze could occasionally fall on others, including his abbot and his fellow monks. Like a few other writers, Wills chose to focus attention on Merton's negative comments about the community at Gethsemane, even going so far as to suggest that Merton intentionally distanced himself from his fellow monks, that he wanted special treatment, not extended to them. But not included in Wills's assessment of Merton are the hundreds of hours of audio tapes we have of him teaching the incoming monks as their novice master. One need only listen to a small sample from these tapes to hear evidence of his clear love for the novices and the clear love that the novices had for him. Nor did Wills take into account the numerous places in Merton's journals in which he wrote movingly about the community of Gethsemane. For example, after walking near the monastery in the fall of 1966, Merton wrote, "I realized how much good there really is in this community, not only in so many individuals, but in the community as it is organized. I know this is a good community and a fortunate place in which to be today." And less than a month before his death, while traveling in Asia, Merton wrote in his journal about how much he loved and missed Gethsemane. None of this negates the negative things he wrote about the community or his fellow monks in other pages in the journal, but it does fill out a complicated picture that is too often presented in an uncomplicated manner. Merton doesn't allow for that kind of simplistic assessment. In a 1967 journal entry, Merton wrote honestly about why he was choosing to leave all of the references to his relationship with M in his journal, knowing that one day all would be known. "I have no intention of keeping the M business entirely out of sight. I've always wanted to be completely open, both about my mistakes and about my effort to make sense out of my life. The affair with M is an important part of it, and shows my limitations as well as a side of me that is, well, it needs to be known too, for it is part of me. My need for love, my loneliness, my inner division, the struggle in which solitude is at once a problem and a solution, and perhaps not a perfect solution either." I feel like there's a humility on display in these words that shows Merton's unwillingness to be known apart from his foibles, apart from the complexity of who he was as a human being, striving to do God's will and often failing. Merton had had enough of pious legends that often characterize our depiction of saints. As he wrote in a 1963 book, Life and Holiness, too often our saints are portrayed in a way that masks their humanity. The stereotypical plaster saint looks like this. The saint, if he ever sinned at all, eventually became impeccable after a perfect conversion. Impeccability not being quite enough, he's raised beyond the faintest possibility of feeling temptation. Of course he's tempted, but temptation provides no difficulties. He always has the absolute and heroic answer. There's a lack of reality to these saints that makes them unapproachable. Moreover, Merton wrote, "Such caricaturing of sanctity is indeed a sin against faith in the incarnation. It shows contempt for the humanity for which Christ did not hesitate to die on the cross." Merton would have none of this for himself. If people were going to know him, they were going to have to know him at his worst, at his weakest, at his most vulnerable. Perhaps this is why many people find in Merton the kind of figure to whom they can relate. Each time I go to the Abbey of Gethsemane, I make a visit to Merton's grave. and each time I'm struck by the ways in which pilgrims venerate his burial place. Surrounding the simple Trappist cross, marking his resting place, are rosaries, prayers, guitar picks, sobriety tokens, art, and wood carvings. I have a sense that this kind of veneration would make very little sense to some who immediately dismiss Merton because of his relationship with M. But there are many, and I include myself among them, who understand Merton to be the kind of Christian who speaks profoundly to them precisely because he was human, but a human who strove throughout his life to be transformed by the love and grace of the God he had come to know so well. Thank you.
Professor Hillis has agreed to field some questions or comments from this great crowd, and so if you field those yourself,
Sure.
and please speak up. We can all hear you with your questions.
Yes.
Would it be too much of a conflation to compare or contrast the relationships of, let's say, an Abelard and Eloise with Merton and them? That's question one.
Yes.
And then question two, which you alluded to in your lecture, his relationship, Merton's thought that he might integrate his love to them as a way to love humankind, which is something I think, as a married Catholic Christian, and since the mystery of the sacrament of matrimony is about
Yes.
service
Yes.
to the world, not just to my spouse, but to the
Right.
world.
Yeah. Are you asking there with the second that is there, was that a legitimate sort of sense that, was he speaking about something that was important? Yeah. Let me take the second question first. And the question, for those of you who didn't hear, was about whether, Merton had something to say about the love that he felt for M as being a way in which he could then love others in the world, that it could be a way to express love for others in the world. I think that is a perfectly legitimate and, in fact, an important understanding of the vocation of marriage. The problem is that that's not the vocation Merton had, right? And so he was kidding himself in thinking that he could, as a hermit, combine his solitude with the not just metaphorical but actual physical love of a woman and for a woman. And there just is no way to do that, and in a way that is compatible with his own vocation. It is a perfectly, and in fact is something that I think we need to emphasize more fully in our theology of marriage, but not something that I think we should incorporate into the monastic vocation, right? In terms of the relationship Abelard and Eloise, I don't think this rises up to that level, if I can put it that way. Yeah. I would love to say that it does, but I don't think so. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm curious about how the relationship affected Merton's understanding of theology, relationship to femininity and women
Yes.
in general. You said it had a large effect on his life, and of course he never had a real relationship, a healthy relationship with a woman beforehand. But you also write in the book about his Mariology, right?
Yes.
His devotion to Mary. And I'm curious about how it affected his devotion to Mary and to women.
Well, I think his devotion to Mary was can be separated, as it can for so many Catholics, from an understanding of femininity and of women, right? He had a very full and rich Mariology that was beautiful. He did not have a full and rich understanding of women. And in fact, we were talking about this in the earlier class. An example of this is he had a series of letters that he wrote back and forth with Rosemary Radford Ruther, a very important feminist theologian. And I never got a chance to meet her, but I knew her from reading her books and also her reputation. And she's a really no-nonsense person. And she was very no-nonsense in her letters to Merton, basically saying, I think your life is worthless, right? Why are you living in a monastery? You could be doing so much better outside the monastery, etc. And Merton received that criticism all the time, but he had never received that kind of criticism from a woman, let alone a very, very well-educated woman. And he got very angry in a letter back to her, and then wrote, is really also cringy, wrote in a letter, the second letter back, I'm sorry I got so angry with, I'm paraphrasing, he's like, I'm sorry I got so angry with you. I just don't really know what to do with an educated woman. Well, that's a really dumb thing to say, right? So his understanding of femininity and of women is very limited. And I find that still to be the case with a lot of the older monks at the monastery who have been at the monastery for 60 years and whatnot since they were young. Now, you can't get into the monastery until you're 25 and you've lived a little and you've had more interaction with other humans and maybe even some relationships and whatnot. And so the younger monks, they're a little more integrated in that way. Yeah.
Questions? Yeah.
So Thomas Merton obviously knew that there were Protestants. He knew that there are Eastern Orthodox priests who are married.
Yeah.
I know you've read his journals so widely. Is there any sense in the rest of the journals that he's reflecting on the vow of celibacy in general, reflecting on other ways of living out even a priestly vocation?
Yeah.
That involves the possibilities of sexuality and romantic love?
Right. So really, the question is about the married priests, which, because he does write about that, he said, well, I wish I had the option to be a married priest. Maybe then I could leave the monastery. Because the reality is that his identity was not just as a monk, it was very much as a priest. He understood his priestly identity to be more important than his monastic identity. And so part of the struggle with his relationship here is that, to follow through with this relationship would be to compromise his very identity as a priest. And so he did end up providing marginal support for movements in the late 1960s that were going on to allow for priests to marry, these sorts of things. We know that nothing came of those, right? But he really didn't think that celibacy was a necessity for the priestly life. And whether he would have left had there been that possibility, I don't know. I don't think so. But.
Yes.
It's all right that I ask another question.
Yeah, please.
I loved reading the book. I had only read your book shortly after reading Seven Storey Mountain.
Yes.
And I was shocked at Merton's confidence over his vocation at Gethsemane because
Yes.
the way he writes about it in Seven Storey Mountain is like he's found the ideal.
Yeah.
And then later he wants to move on again and eventually he becomes a hermit. But I also sometimes get the impression that he kind of never would have been happy wherever he ended up.
Yeah.
He seems always to have some kind of issue. And I imagine the same would be true. I mean, if he had left the monastery, he probably, everyone married eventually.
Yes.
Regrets and stuff, as I understand.
Yeah.
So what do you think about Merton's sense of self, sense of vocation? Was he always striving, or could he, if he had lived longer, might he have found someplace where he could finally
Right. Well, so the question had to do with, Merton's continued restlessness, because throughout the 50s, really 1952 to 1956, and then again in 59 and 60 and 61 and 62. So a number of years. He was really struggling.